Michael Carter had just settled into his new apartment in Los Angeles, a modern building filled with tenants and monitored security. 11 days later, he disappeared without warning. His phone was left charging on the kitchen counter. His wallet sat untouched beside it. The front door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the apartment. When investigators reviewed the hallway security footage, they found something they couldn't explain. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Michael's apartment door slowly opened and then shut again. No one was seen walking in. No one was seen walking out. The hallway remained completely empty. Police later discovered someone else had access to the apartment. Watch till the end to find out what happened to Michael. Michael Carter was 32 years old, quiet and routine-driven. He worked a standard 9-to-5 job in IT support, mostly remote, spending his days troubleshooting systems, answering tickets, and keeping to himself. He wasn't the type to attract attention. No history of conflict, no known enemies, no sudden changes in behavior. To most people around him, Michael was just another tenant living an ordinary life. A few weeks before his disappearance, Michael had moved into the apartment for what he described to a co-worker as a fresh start. He had been living across the city before, sharing space with a roommate, but decided he needed something different, somewhere quieter, somewhere he could focus and reset. The apartment he found seemed to offer exactly that. The building was located in a busy part of Los Angeles. Cars passed regularly, neighbors came and went at all hours, and the property itself had modern security features, keycard access, surveillance cameras in the hallways, and reinforced doors. It wasn't isolated in any way, which made what happened later even harder to explain. What stood out to Michael at the time was the price. The apartment was slightly cheaper than others in the same area. Not drastically, but enough to raise a small question in his mind. Still, everything looked clean, recently maintained, and fully functional. There were no visible issues during the viewing. The landlord, a man named Richard, was unusually eager to close the deal. According to records and email exchanges, he responded almost immediately to Michael's inquiry and pushed for a quick move-in date. During their brief meeting, he reassured Michael several times about the building's safety. "You'll love how secure it is," he said. At the time, it sounded like a selling point. Keycard entry, monitored hallways, locked doors. It all added to the appeal. Michael signed the lease the same day. In the days that followed, his routine remained consistent. He worked during the day, occasionally stepped out for groceries, and spent most evenings inside. Neighbors later described him as polite, but distant. A few had seen him in passing, exchanging short greetings in the hallway, but no one knew him well. Nothing about Michael's behavior suggested anything was wrong, until the night everything changed. In the first few days after moving in, Michael settled into a routine that felt almost effortless. His mornings were quiet. He would wake up, make coffee in the small kitchen, and log into work from his laptop at the dining table. Most of his tasks were repetitive: system checks, password resets, minor troubleshooting requests. It was the kind of work that didn't demand much attention beyond the screen in front of him. By evening, his schedule rarely changed. He ordered takeout or cooked something simple, then spent hours scrolling through his phone or watching shows until he felt tired enough to sleep. It was exactly the kind of life he had wanted: predictable, controlled, and undisturbed. From the outside, Everything about Michael's new life appeared completely normal. But within that normal routine, small things began to stand out. At first, they were easy to dismiss. The front door, for example. It locked properly and the mechanism worked as expected. But there were moments when it didn't feel as firm as it should. When Michael turned the lock, there was a slight give in the handle afterward, almost like the door wasn't fully settled into place. The first time he noticed it, he checked it twice, then a third time, just to be sure. It stayed locked. Still, the feeling lingered. A few days later, something else started happening. Michael would leave the apartment, usually for groceries or a quick walk. And halfway down the hallway, a thought would hit him. Did I actually lock the door? It wasn't a passing thought. It stayed with him long enough to make him turn around more than once. Each time, he would return, check the handle, and confirm that it was locked exactly as he had left it. There was no sign of tampering, no indication that anything had been touched. After a while, he started telling himself it was just stress. A new place, a new environment, adjusting to being alone again. It made sense. Then there was the smell. It wasn't constant. It came and went without any clear pattern. Some evenings, when he stepped into the hallway, there would be a faint, unfamiliar odor, something slightly stale, difficult to identify, not strong enough to alarm anyone, but noticeable enough that it didn't feel normal. Other tenants didn't mention it, at least not that he heard, and building maintenance never addressed anything unusual. The strange part was how quickly it disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as if it had never existed at all. Inside the apartment, everything remained in place. Nothing moved, nothing went missing. Michael's belongings stayed exactly where he left them. His laptop, his clothes, his keys, untouched. If anything had been wrong, it wasn't visible. And outside, the city continued as usual. Traffic filled the streets at all hours. Voices echoed faintly from nearby apartments. Elevators moved. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps passed through the hallway. The constant background noise created a kind of cover, blending everything together into a steady, familiar rhythm. It made it easy to ignore the smaller details. A soft sound from the other side of a wall could be anything. Pipes, neighbors, the building settling. A faint shift near the door could be dismissed just as quickly. Nothing stood out enough to demand attention. So, Michael adjusted. He stopped double-checking the door as often. He ignored the smell when it appeared. He convinced himself that everything he noticed had a simple explanation, even if he couldn't immediately identify it. From the outside, his life continued exactly as before. But the longer he stayed, the harder it became to tell whether the things he was noticing were just coincidences or something he hadn't fully understood yet. By the end of the first week, the routine was still there, but something beneath it had started to shift. The first time Michael noticed it, he almost didn't react at all. It was late, sometime after midnight. He had fallen asleep on the couch with the television still on, the glow of the screen flickering across the room. At some point during the night, he woke up briefly, not fully alert, just enough to register a sound, a soft click. It came from somewhere beyond the living area, faint and distant, like a door gently settling into place. For a few seconds, Michael stayed still, listening. The sound didn't repeat. The apartment was quiet again, except for the low hum of the city outside. He told himself it was nothing. Pipes, maybe, or the building structure adjusting. Places like this always had small noises, especially at night. He closed his eyes and went back to sleep. 2 nights later, something else happened. Michael woke up in his bed just after 3 a.m. This time, there was no sound to explain it. He simply opened his eyes, suddenly aware that he was no longer fully asleep. The apartment felt still, almost too still, as if everything had paused. He got up, walked into the kitchen, and that's when he noticed it. One of the cabinet doors was slightly open, not wide enough to immediately stand out, but enough to be noticeable. Just a few inches, angled outward. Michael stopped and stared at it for a moment. He was certain he had closed it earlier. He had cleaned up after dinner, put everything away, and shut every cabinet before going to bed. It was part of his habit. He didn't like leaving things unfinished. He stepped closer and pushed the cabinet door shut. It closed normally. No resistance, no loose hinges. Nothing about it seemed broken. For a few seconds, he stood there, trying to recall if there was any chance he had left it open without realizing. The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. Eventually, he shook it off. It wasn't impossible. People forget small things all the time. Still, when he went back to bed, his sleep wasn't as steady. By the 5th night, the pattern became harder to ignore. That evening had been like any other. Michael finished work, ordered food, and spent a few hours on his phone before heading upstairs to sleep. There was nothing unusual about the night itself, but the next morning, something felt off. It started near the front door. Michael reached for his shoes, the pair he always left neatly side by side against the wall. Except now, they weren't quite the same. One of them had shifted slightly forward, angled differently from the other. It was subtle, easy to miss, but he noticed. He stood there for a moment, staring down at them, trying to remember how he had left them the night before. The image in his mind felt clear. They had been aligned, placed evenly as always. Now, they weren't. He looked around the apartment. Everything else appeared untouched. Then he saw the light. A small lamp in the living room was still on. Michael was sure he had turned it off before going upstairs. It wasn't something he would normally forget. Leaving lights on bothered him. It was one of those small details he always controlled. He walked over and switched it off, his movements slower this time. The apartment remained exactly as it should have been. The door was still locked from the inside. The windows were secure. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been there. Everything was intact. And yet, things were not where he had left them. That was when the doubt started to settle in. At first, he tried to explain it logically. Stress could affect memory. Moving into a new place, adjusting to a different environment, it could make anyone a little forgetful. Maybe he had left the cabinet open without realizing. Maybe he had kicked his shoes slightly out of place. Maybe he had been more tired than he thought. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but together, they began to feel less convincing. Michael started paying closer attention to his own actions. Before going to bed, he would double-check everything. The doors, the lights, even small details like the position of objects on the table. He wanted certainty, something he could rely on. And still, each morning, there was always something small that didn't match. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be easily proven. Just enough to make him question whether the problem was with the apartment or with himself. By the second week, the pattern changed. What had once felt like small, scattered inconsistencies began to follow a direction, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it settled in. It started with the bedroom door. Michael had developed a habit over the past few nights. Before going to bed, he would check the front door twice, sometimes 3 times, then walk upstairs and lock his bedroom door from the inside. It gave him a sense of control, a clear boundary between himself and everything else in the apartment. On the 10th night, he followed that same routine. He checked the front door, locked. He turned off the lights downstairs. Nothing left on. He went upstairs, stepped into his bedroom, and locked the door behind him. He remembered the sound clearly, the click of the lock sliding into place. That night, his sleep was restless. He woke up just after sunrise, not fully alert, but aware enough to notice something immediately. The door. It wasn't closed. It was slightly open, not wide, not enough to swing freely, but just enough to create a narrow gap between the door and the frame. Michael sat up slowly, staring at it. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He tried to replay the night in his head, trying to find any moment where he might have gotten up, unlocked the door, and opened it without remembering. Nothing came to mind. He got out of bed and walked toward it carefully. The lock was no longer engaged. He tested it, turned it once, twice. It worked normally. No damage, no looseness, but that didn't explain how it had been opened. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Sleepwalking, maybe. It wasn't something he had experienced before, but it wasn't impossible. Still, the idea didn't sit right. That same day, something else happened. Michael had been working from his laptop in the living room. Around mid-afternoon, he stepped away to take a call, leaving the device open on the table. When he returned a few minutes later, the screen had changed. A different page was open. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a blank search page, the cursor blinking in the search bar. But Michael knew that wasn't what he had left on the screen. He stood there for a moment, staring at it. Then he checked his browsing history. There was no record of the page being opened. No clicks, no new tabs, nothing that showed how it had changed. For the first time, he didn't immediately try to explain it away. That night, he moved more carefully through his routine. He checked every lock again, tested the windows, walked through each room, making sure everything was exactly where it should be. When he finally went upstairs, he locked his bedroom door and stood there for a few seconds longer than usual, his hand still resting on the handle. Then he went to bed. Sometime during the night, he woke up again. This time, there was no sound, no movement, just a quiet awareness that something was different. He turned his head slightly and saw it, a glass of water, sitting on the small table beside his bed. Michael froze. He didn't keep water in his bedroom. It wasn't part of his routine. If he needed anything, he went downstairs. That had always been his habit. Slowly, he reached out and touched the glass. It was real, half full. He pulled his hand back and sat there in silence, staring at it. There was no explanation he could reach for this time. No memory gap he could rely on. No simple mistake. It was just there, placed beside him while he slept. The next morning, Michael made a decision. He needed something objective. Something that didn't rely on memory or perception. Something that would show him exactly what was happening inside the apartment when he wasn't aware. That afternoon, He went out and bought a small indoor security camera. Nothing advanced, just a basic model that connected to his phone and recorded continuously. He set it up in the living room, angled toward the front door. If anything was happening, it would capture it. That night, his routine changed again. He checked the locks more times than he could count. Front door, windows, bedroom door, over and over until he felt a brief moment of certainty. Then he went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound pulled his attention back to the surface. Every shift in the apartment made it harder to relax. At some point, exhaustion took over and he drifted off. The next morning, the first thing he did was reach for his phone. He opened the camera app, scrolled through the footage. For a while, everything looked normal. The living room remained still. No movement, no changes. Hours passed on screen without anything unusual. Then he reached 2:17 a.m. The timestamp sat clearly in the corner of the footage. Michael leaned closer. The front door was in full view. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the lock turned by itself. Michael felt his breath catch as he watched. The handle shifted slightly, just enough to release the latch. The door opened a few inches, and then it stopped. There was nothing in the doorway. No figure, no shadow, nothing entering or leaving. After a few seconds, the door moved again, closing. The latch clicked back into place, and just like that, everything was still. Michael replayed the footage. Once, twice, again and again. Each time, the same result. No one appeared. Nothing explained it. The door had unlocked and opened on its own. That was the moment everything changed. The doubt he had been holding on to, the idea that this could all be stress, forgetfulness, or some kind of adjustment, began to fall apart. Because now, there was proof. Something inside the apartment was not under his control. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, listening to every sound in the building, every footstep in the hallway, every distant noise from outside, every shift in the structure of the apartment. His mind wouldn't slow down. He started checking the locks repeatedly, moving from one door to another, over and over, as if confirming them enough times would make a difference. But each time he stepped away, the same thought followed him. If the door could unlock itself once, then it could happen again, and the next time, it might not stop at the doorway. By the third week, Michael stopped trying to ignore it. The footage had removed any doubt he still held on to. What he had seen on his phone that morning stayed with him, replaying in his mind, even when he tried to focus on something else. It wasn't just the movement of the door. It was the absence of anything causing it. Now, everything in the apartment felt different. He started looking closer, not casually, not the way he had before, but with intent, like he was trying to prove something to himself. The first thing he checked was the front door. At a glance, it looked normal. Solid frame, intact lock, no visible damage. But when he leaned in, running his fingers slowly along the metal around the keyhole, he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before. Scratches. They were small, faint, almost invisible, unless you were looking for them. Thin lines etched into the surface around the keyhole, overlapping in different directions. Michael stepped back slightly, then leaned in again, adjusting the angle of the light. The marks became clearer. They weren't random. They looked like wear, like something had been inserted into the lock repeatedly over time. Not just normal use, more than that. He moved to the back door next. He hadn't used it much since moving in. It led to a narrow exterior corridor that connected to the building's rear access. Most tenants seemed to rely on the main entrance, and Michael had followed the same pattern. When he grabbed the handle, he immediately noticed the difference. It felt loose, not broken, not enough to fail, but worn in a way that didn't match how little he had used it. The lock turned smoothly, too smoothly, like it had been handled far more often than it should have been. He tested it again. Locked, unlocked, locked. Each time, the movement felt familiar, like it had been repeated over and over again by someone else. Michael stepped away slowly. His attention shifted back to the rest of the... He began checking everything. Windows, corners, hinges, even the edges of furniture. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but he kept going, as if something might reveal itself if he looked long enough. The more he searched, the more the apartment started to feel unfamiliar. Not because anything obvious had changed, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't been the only one moving through it. That afternoon, he decided to call the landlord. Richard answered on the second ring. His tone was the same as before, calm, slightly distant, almost too relaxed. Michael tried to keep his voice steady as he explained what he had noticed. The door, the camera footage, the scratches, the back lock. He didn't go into every detail, but enough to make it clear that something wasn't right. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Richard responded. "Oh, there are spare keys," he said, casually, "but no one's used them in years." Michael frowned. "Spare keys?" he asked. "Yeah," Richard replied. "Standard procedure. Maintenance, emergencies, things like that. But like I said, no one's needed them in a long time." His tone didn't change. No concern, no urgency. Just a simple explanation, delivered as if it closed the conversation. Michael hesitated. "Who has access to them?" he asked. Another short pause. "They're kept secure," Richard said. "You don't need to worry about that." The call ended not long after. Michael lowered his phone slowly, his mind fixed on the way the landlord had answered. It wasn't what he said. It was how easily he said it. That night, Michael didn't follow his usual routine. He didn't try to relax. He didn't distract himself. Instead, he made a decision. He was going to stay awake, but not in a way that made it obvious. He turned off the lights at the usual time, moved through the apartment the same way he always did, checked the locks, went upstairs, and closed his bedroom door. Then he lay down on the bed, still, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady, just enough to mimic sleep. Minutes passed. Then, an hour. The apartment remained quiet, the usual distant noise of the city filtering in from outside. Michael didn't move. He kept his focus on listening. Every small shift in the building felt amplified. Every faint sound carried more weight than it should have. Time stretched. At some point, the night grew deeper, heavier, and then a sound. Soft, precise, a click. Not from far away, not from outside, from within the apartment. Michael felt his body tense instantly, but he didn't move. He kept his breathing steady, listened. Another sound followed, subtle, measured, like something adjusting. Somewhere downstairs. He stayed still, his eyes still closed, his entire focus fixed on the space beyond his bedroom door, waiting, because this time, he wasn't going to miss it. Around 2:17 a.m. He hears it, soft footsteps inside the house, a key, turning slowly in his bedroom door. This is the turning point. The sound came again. Closer this time. A slow, deliberate shift, like pressure being applied carefully, with control. Michael kept his eyes closed. Every instinct in his body was telling him to move, to sit up, to look, but he didn't. He forced himself to stay still, keeping his breathing steady, shallow, consistent. If something was inside the apartment, he needed to know what it would do next. The bedroom door. He heard it before he felt it. A soft release in the lock. Then the faintest movement along the frame. The door began to open, slowly, not pushed all at once, not forced, just a controlled, quiet motion, inch by inch, as if whoever was on the other side knew exactly how to avoid making noise. Michael felt a cold tension spread through his chest. The gap widened, air shifted slightly in the room, and then silence. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No footsteps, no sudden movement. Just the presence of the door, now standing open behind him. Michael stayed still, listening. Then he heard it, a step, soft, careful, inside the room. His heart started to pound, but he forced his breathing to remain even, the rhythm of someone still asleep. Every part of him was focused on not reacting. Another step followed, closer. The movement wasn't rushed. There was no hesitation in it either. It was controlled, familiar. Like whoever had entered the room knew exactly where everything was. Michael could hear the faint shift of weight on the floor, the subtle contact of movement just a few feet away from the bed. The person didn't bump into anything, didn't search around, didn't adjust to the space. They moved like they had done this before, more than once. The steps stopped, right beside him. Michael felt it without seeing it. Someone was standing there, close enough that he could sense the presence, the stillness, the weight of someone just watching. Seconds passed, then longer. Nothing happened. No reaching, no searching, no attempt to take anything. Just standing there, watching him. The silence stretched in a way that felt unnatural, heavy with intent. Michael could feel his pulse in his ears now, loud enough that he was sure it had to be heard. His fingers tensed slightly against the mattress, but he kept the rest of his body completely still. Then, a voice, low, calm, close enough that it didn't need to be loud. "You're not supposed to be awake." Michael's chest tightened instantly. The words were clear, direct, spoken like a quiet correction rather than a threat. In that moment, the control he had been holding onto broke. His breathing hitched, just slightly, but enough. And the presence beside him reacted. A shift, fast, closer. Michael's eyes snapped open as he turned, and everything collapsed into movement at once. The figure was right there. Too close. Michael tried to pull back, to get off the bed, to create distance. His body moved, his hands pushing against the mattress. And then, cut. By morning, Michael Carter was gone. No signs of struggle, no damage to the apartment. The doors were locked from the inside, just like before. Police searched the entire unit. Everything appeared untouched. His belongings were still there. Phone, wallet, laptop. Nothing suggested he had planned to leave. The investigation quickly focused on access. That's when they found it. Multiple copies of the apartment keys existed. Some were accounted for. Others were not. When officers reviewed the security footage again, they noticed something they had missed the first time. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the front door unlocked, opened slightly, and this time, there was something else. a faint shadow, barely visible, standing just outside the frame. No one ever identified who had those keys, but whoever it was knew exactly how to enter without being seen and how to leave without a trace. If you like this mystery, chilling video, don't forget to like and subscribe.